to make it clear.
Order. Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, he is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning, and she is from New Zealand's largest feminist blog, The Hand Mirror, commentator and blogger Julie Ferry. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1. Is it opportunistic for John Key to claim Māori are being opportunistic over the Waitangi water claim? Issue 2. Is road tolling the only solution to Auckland's infrastructure funding? And if it is equitable for the working classes and the poor? And issue 3. Are street prostitutes the new boy racers? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. John Key has gone from saying there is more chance of a meteorite striking the planet than delaying his asset sales to quietly accepting there will be a delay in asset sales. Looks like the meteorite's on its way, Selwyn. How is Māori seeking legal definition of water rights opportunistic when it's John Key's action of selling state assets that's initiated the Waitangi tribunal process?
Yeah, I think this whole issue has underscored, this ironic kind of situation that politicians can dig themselves in when they have a want to.
Yeah.
It's an unnecessary kind of diversion, really, away from the big issue. But clearly there's been a lot of reinvention going over the last week, particularly by the Prime Minister in the first instance, saying, I was not criticising the process relating to the Waitangi Tribunal. I was merely stating that a government does not need to adhere to what the tribunal comes out in its opinion or its conclusion. Well, sorry, Prime Minister, we all knew that, but what he was doing was undermining the process and taking away this element of respect for the Waitangi Tribunal. Yeah. Now, clearly, over the week since, there's this weird situation where we've got to say we did predict. Gordon Campbell wrote a very good piece basically saying after a week they'll have a meeting and they'll come out saying everything's fine and dandy. Yeah. And that's exactly what has taken place. I think what is very much in frame here, though, is that the Māori Party has become almost contrary to the point and purpose of why it was formed in the first place. Sure. And I think that is the danger that both Tariana Turia as a co-leader and Peter Sharples as the other co-leader have fallen into here. It's a political trap, and it's one they really cannot come out of.
What's the point of sitting at the table, which is always their justification, if John Key has sold the table?
Well, John Key is very much a charmer, and he knows the news cycles. He knows that if you give an issue like this that's potentially contentious when people are pressed against the wall and in a corner, you give it a bit of time, a bit of air to breathe, a bit of charm and smile, and a bit of persuasiveness of, I am the man in power here, so a bit of respect goes both ways, and then you'll get an outcome. But underneath this, there will be no doubt, and I'm obviously not Māori, but I would anticipate that there was an issue of where many felt their mana was dented and the mana of the Treaty of Waitangi was dented, and that is irreparable.
Julie, is it one of the dangers of consistently insulting the Māori Council that it guts the credibility of the Māori Party?
I think Selwyn's raised some really good issues on that point too, and I think that what we've seen over time as the Māori Party has developed is that it has become more aligned, I feel, with some of the corporate Māori interests than with sort of grassroots Māori interests. And why wouldn't we see a similar structure in terms of Māori politics as we see in mainstream politics? We have National that represents more corporate business-based interests, the individual. We have Labour that is more focused on the collective and the interests of those in vulnerable positions. And I think we're starting to see a real shift over this issue in particular. The Mana Party is probably the one that most naturally is starting to have that groundswell of connection with the Māori community. But it's a very different political game in Māoridom than it is in Pākehā politics. And the role of the iwi Leaders Group, the Māori Council, all of these things, which to those who've been watching Māori politics for a long time will probably make a lot of sense and be easily understandable for those like me who are now coming across these structures for the first time in the context of water rights. Getting your head around how they fit together is quite complex. and the connection between the Māori Party and the Māori Council. There's a lot of, dare I say, the pun, water to go under the bridge on this issue yet. And if what the very concept of water ownership as opposed to water rights is something that I think a lot of the public and a lot of the media analysis has not really delved into. That, we have a situation here where there have been concerns within Māoridom around the control of water for a long time, but they were always prepared to slowly but surely work through it, cooperate, collaborate, until we now have a point where some of the water control is going to get privatised.
Sure.
And now is the time to discuss it.
Do you think National have abandoned the Māori Party as a political force post-2014? I mean, they are looking at changes with an MMP to lower the threshold to 4. That would help the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
Are they looking to replace the Māori Party? Have they used up their usefulness?
I think National have got some real issues around coalition partners in the future, and we've seen that with the demise of ACT. And the Māori Party, there are some real questions there about whether they can hold those seats after the departure of those particular people, whether the seats are loyal to the Māori Party or whether they are loyal to those individuals. I think they've got some real problems in terms of succession planning, and that creates a problem for National about future coalition partners. If I were John Key, I'd be looking around. Yeah,
absolutely. So when the Māori Council warned the newly formed freshwater iwi last month not to turn Māori against Māori by cutting a side deal to allow the asset sales to process, can divide and rule tactics work here?
I guess time will tell on this one. You get a sense that what is going to happen here is that National Party and John Key will get his way. That Māori will go through the process of getting a position, a legal position that the tribunal will export. That will be obviously an indicator of how various groups may seek recourse later on.
After the sale.
After the sale. And I think that's where things are going. If you watch the flow of this, to pinch another water word, that would be really where we are. I think the whole problem here in the current frame is that the Prime Minister is looking in a short-term kind of frame. He's looking for a win on this to satisfy many in his own natural party, his own constituencies, his own stakeholder groups. The long-term gain, as what you've said, Julie, is clearly going to undermine the confidence that for many centrist Māori, that the Māori Party represents their interests. It's already down below 1% in the current MMP structure. It is political oblivion, most likely, for the Māori Party as far as having the numbers to help National get back. We have seen a demarcation line. Tariana Turia this morning reportedly said, we have got an agreement that we're happy with the government. And it is promised it will not legislate like the Labour Party did to exclude our people from gaining or seeking rights here.
Julie, John Armstrong notes that this is difficult for the Labour Party because they are trying to keep Māori on side as well as conservative-minded Pākehā. How does David Shearer play this?
I think that what we've seen is a position that Shearer has taken to date, that everyone owns water, and in contrast, Key has been saying no one owns water. And Matthew Houghton has been saying that the two things are equal. I see them as completely different, actually, totally opposite. And so I think that for Shearer, going down the line of everyone owns the water is probably going to be, quite smart. It's quite warm and fuzzy. It's something,
inclusive, isn't it?
Exactly, it's inclusive. It will appeal to those more conservative Pākehā who were worried about, in the foreshore and seabed debate, that we were going to lose access to the beaches, which of course hasn't happened. And it will also appeal to Māori because it has that principle of kaitiakitanga, of guardianship, of stewardship, all embraced in that term, everyone owns the water. So I think how he's playing it so far is quite smart. I'd be really keen to be a fly on the wall in that Māori caucus though, because I suspect there are some different views around the table.
There's one thing that hasn't been elevated here, that remember customary rights were a part of the legislation that National put through. That gives legitimate right. Now, that is something that I'm wondering whether or not that is a major component that comes out of the Waitangi Tribunal. If so, it has a ruling, a view, should I say, on that, a legal view, then maybe there is something even currently within National's own legislature that gives an opportunity for those who do not want to see, this go ahead, to actually work on. It'll
Fine.
be interesting.
Final question to both of you. Who are the political winners and losers in this tribunal process?
Well, I think long term, yeah, Māori Party are the losers on this. I think it has given the factions within the Labour Party itself that naturally used to affiliate very closely with iwi Māori the opportunity of swaying some of that. It creates a line between corporate Māori interests and perhaps iwi-based Māori interests that we haven't seen for a long time.
Yes, yeah, good point. Who's the winners, who the losers?
I think if Labour play this smart, they could be winners.
Yep.
I'd be really interested to see where Hone Harawira goes with this, because we haven't heard a lot from him so far, and he could be a big winner.
Annette Sykes, some amazing criticism thrown at the Māori Party this week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, Len Brown wants $1.1 million spent on a consensus building group to plan a way to make Aucklanders pay for more transport infrastructure. The 21-member consensus building group will consider a regional fuel tax, road tolls, or increased car parking fees. Are increased transport costs what Auckland's working poor need? Selwyn, let's look at this consensus building group. Guy Salmon, Michael Barnett, Tony Garner, the Property Council, the Automobile Association, Gary Taylor, and 12 other token appointments meeting for a 12 two-day monthly meeting plus dinners. How are they going to manage to A, come up with a funding solution, and B, convince central government to do it?
Well, a lot of the names that you just mentioned have got very close ties to central government.
They
at
do,
the
they're
moment,
very good
particularly
friends.
when National is actually sitting in office. So maybe there's something going on there, if there is any political strategy going on around Len Brown, and that's the question.
It's a vacuum, isn't it?
Then maybe they're saying, get these guys on side, try and find a way of bringing the national-led government into a dialogue here on these funding issues.
Yeah.
Perhaps that is a step toward an outcome that's not necessarily representative of what we could expect to come out of the group that's being formed.
Right.
But, I mean, that's a long shot,
yes,
Bomber.
yeah,
That's
it's
a
very
long
long
shot,
shot.
considering that most of the advisors that are centred around Len Brown's thinking at the moment clearly seem to be from the official side of things.
Yeah.
We know for decades local government has been the bastion of centrist and centre-right politicians that have exited, or those that aspire to grease the wheel of centre-right politics. And it's that kind of concern, I think, that's born within your questions, in a sense that not necessarily from a political left-right bias, but by the way and means in which they're going to fund what New Aucklanders are demanding occur.
Julie, traffic volume on state highways across New Zealand hasn't risen since 2005,
Yep.
while public transport patronage in Auckland has increased by a third in only 4 years. Is the problem here that we are addicted to short-term motorway infrastructure rather than long-term public transport infrastructure?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. There is a real problem in our political culture around always putting roads first. And we see, for example, the roads of national significance, massive amount of
Billions.
government funding,
Yeah.
and also the commitment that comes within government in terms of staffing and resourcing to make those things happen, just not being reflected with public transport funding and planning. And we know that public transport has to be the future of where we go with our planning around transport in Auckland. It has to be. We're only going to get bigger, and we're going to have more people. We're going to need to move them around in more imaginative ways. And the private car, single trips, it's not going to do it. So why aren't we investing more in those kind of possibilities?
And it's even a necessity, I think, if you bought into the National Party's plan and what was discussed around its recent summit with local government representatives down in Queenstown last week. It was showing that there's this debate on really should large cities or amalgamated councils extend their boundaries as opposed to condensing or making a vertical kind of plan happen here. So it gets down to the really heart of that. And there's still, I think, that underscores and presents an argument where there are the very, very powerful politicians and very powerful officials that are not yet convinced that Auckland should actually try to hold on to its current
That's
border.
right.
That's
That's
right.
right. They want urban sprawl.
They want
urban sprawl.
They see it
Yep.
as a way and means of assuming growth.
Yeah, and the argument is always put forward, isn't it? If we allowed our spaces to open up, we'd be able to build cheaper houses, and that would bring the affordability issue down. And that's a game that's consistently played, isn't it?
Now, I think sometimes, these kind of conferences that the government embarks on, particularly in local government area, can from the outside look very, very boring. But really, what is going on there is some real think tank stuff, and it's materialising into policy direction.
Selwyn, won't tolling roads hurt the poor and the working classes, and in fact push those sections of the community off onto the public transport system, which is patchy and underfunded at the best of times?
Well, in current situation, it would hurt those that once were in the middle classes who have cars that are feeling the pinch under this particular government.
Yeah.
Those who are really, really having their faces rubbed in the mud, they won't be able to go on those roads because they haven't got the vehicles to build or the money to buy the petrol to get on. That's the way it's headed.
Julie, will freedom of movement be an old concept alongside public education in the 40-hour week? Is that where they want to move us to?
I think that there are some real issues around how particularly networking charges and tolling could affect people's movement around the city.
Yeah.
And I think also it's worth considering that these kind of charges often are about behaviour change as opposed to revenue gathering.
Yeah.
And so if they do drive a behaviour change, you actually get less revenue. And so if you're relying on tolling and congestion charging to raise revenue for public transport, then if you shift people's behaviour to using public transport, you are actually cutting away at your revenue stream. And that's a perverse incentive, really.
It is, and of course this whole tolling argument debate is avoiding a realisation that, remember, first on the pressure ticket should be that the national-led government campaigned in 2008 to deliver with infrastructure.
That's right.
That was the biggest, obviously it's the biggest lie that it had ever coughed in recent times. It has never come up to Auckland and said, right, apart from its roading kind of things that no one wants, this is what we're going to do for you, your public demand is this. Our promise in 2008 was we would develop infrastructure. Here we go, let's work the plan. Instead, it's been coy, it's been reticent to engage, and we're left scratching around to think, well, should we charge $2 on a toll? And I'm sorry, it doesn't wash.
Complete lack of imagination, isn't it?
It's also a really inefficient way of gathering revenue.
No.
You know, the infrastructure that you have to put in place in terms of the technology is huge.
Yeah.
And in some cities overseas, you've actually seen that it's delivered a minuscule amount above the cost of running it.
And
So
the
what's
other
the
thing
point?
is it's an ACT party plan.
Yes.
So, we know we're actors in the polls. Why are we susceptible to this ideology?
Final question, both of you on this. With central government pressuring councils not to borrow and refusing to stump up the cash itself, what options can Auckland hope for in getting a working public transport system? And if they're not going to come up with the cash and they're not going to allow the councils to borrow, what does Auckland do?
Well, I think as a cumulative body, it actually starts to mobilise. It communicates its dissatisfaction with that. It politicises it and it puts it to the vote.
Yeah.
I know that's what that's the way I think as an individual. Is you do something about it. You exercise your right with the power that's available to you to exclude those that are going to advance something that's contrary to your interests.
Yeah. What does Len do here?
Well, I think it's really interesting your point about the borrowing, because council currently does fund major infrastructure projects by borrowing. It can't really do it off the rates base, because then you'd have to do things in a piecemeal way. But
and the Auditor General said, look, if government doesn't come to the party on your central loop here, well then your figures don't.
That's right, they don't add up. But the National Land Transport Fund is only allowed to fund things from its income. It's not allowed to borrow to fund major transport infrastructure. And so the kind of really big hit that we need in public transport in Auckland, particularly the Central Rail Link, we don't have a lot of options. And I think council has to look quite seriously at reprioritising some of the other local roading spending.
So you think council's got to step up? Servicing itself?
I don't know that council can't do it all on its own.
No,
I completely agree with
But
Selwyn about the
it's got
political.
1,200,000 people right behind it.
That's right.
Surely those numbers have got to compel.
And I wonder if that's part of the thinking behind the consensus building group, although personally that's not the way I would go about it. I would do something that was much more grassroots based rather than sort of picking some poppies to talk to the other poppies.
Of course, on this program not too long ago, Jacinda Ardern, who's obviously in that top echelons of Labour policy making much gave a commitment that
That's right.
Labor would come through and deliver on
Yes,
these
that's
plans
right, that's
for
right.
Auckland.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
Now, that's got to be factored in. And I know that polls and votes can go two ways, but if it's almost like there has to be two plans in parallel. One with the current lot that are there, and another one with what is possible.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, a mayor-endorsed booklet critical of street prostitutes in South Auckland seems to have declared open season for legislation aimed at sex workers. Are South Auckland prostitutes the new boy racers? Selwyn, Len says legislative support is needed to combat the uninhabited spread of street prostitution. Is he right?
Well, let's peel it away before we do a yes or no answer on that one. Street prostitution is clearly not in the interests of, one, the sex workers. It's not in the interests of the general public. It's not in the interests of the ambience of particular areas, and it's not in the interests of the shop and businesses that are around that area. So something has to be done.
Yep.
Clearly the status quo relating to the tools that are available to people to act on are not satisfactory. But there needs to be a more complex layer of just doing a broken windows type of approach, and we're not going to have any of the scourge in our area, so we're going to lock them up or move them on to another area. You know, that's not going to work. It's got to be sophisticated and it's got to be coordinated. I have sympathies for those who once were able to take their children or perhaps their elderly parents down to particular areas in Manurewa and certainly Hunter's Corner in South Auckland, and now they feel that they probably cannot, and I have sympathies for the public businesses that would, you know, have to clean up mess each morning that they want to trade. And I have sympathies for the politicians who are dying to actually do something but haven't got the tools. It's a conscience vote, in my view, and it's one where we have to resist trying to actually stigmatise a group as well.
Julie, I did a show for TV3 about a decade ago called Stakeout. We looked into this issue of underage prostitutes at this exact place in South Auckland. Talking and interviewing the young women there, the thing that came across was that many of these women were being abused at home. That's why they were on the street. They had difficult lives. And I wonder genuinely if making life even more difficult for them by targeting them with $2,000 fines and arresting their clients, isn't that going to make a difficult position even more difficult for these people?
I agree completely, and I think, you know, I've been thinking, I'm a local board member myself in a different part of Auckland, and I've been thinking about this issue quite a lot. It does seem to be quite unique to these two locations, as Selwyn's pointed out. We do need to peel that back and see what's actually going on there, because clearly this is an issue of poverty. You know, that it's not like it's a highly desirable job, street work in particular. And so why exactly? And so, you know, these are obviously people who feel they don't have a lot of other employment choices, and they also don't have a lot of choices in terms of where else they can do it.
And many of them are children.
And a lot of the brothels in the area have actually been closed down. And that's forced a lot of these workers onto the street.
That's right.
And it's not safe for them either. So, you know, there has to be some other stuff going on there. Why does it work in K Road? And it is generally acknowledged that it does, but it doesn't in Papatoetoe and Manurewa. What's going on there? And to me, that's not necessarily about the regulatory toolkit.
You know, one of the things I would say is it's a socio-economic dynamic.
Well, and that's what it comes down to. Isn't this a symptom of a much deeper problem with poverty?
I agree completely on that.
And where's Labour's Ross Robertson on this issue?
Where is he? Where is Ross Robertson?
He's got to go.
Wise words.
Maybe
Wise
Labour's
words.
reform in the candidate selection will sort that out.
Fingers crossed. Let's wrap this show with last words. Selwyn, your last word this week is.
This ironic situation is developed, and I did a report for 36parallel.com where it showed that Fijian personnel in UN peacekeeping operations had actually increased by 144% from 2006 to current day. They contribute more peacekeepers to UN operations globally than what Australia, New Zealand and Canada does combined.
No way.
And yet our governments in Australia and New Zealand have long argued that Fiji should be excluded from peacekeeping operations. I suggest that there will be a thaw in New Zealand's policy relating to Fiji in the spring when the Pacific Islands Forum occurs, and there'll probably be a re-engagement plan rolled out around that point.
Are we doing that because America's pushing us to?
America gave Frank Bainimarama, the military
yeah,
leader, and
yeah.
some refer to as a dictator, an open visa to the United States in October last year.
Yep.
It engaged Frankie Reid as its new ambassador to
Yep.
Suva, who's been opening doors. New Zealand and Australia are out of step at the moment.
Yeah.
Other countries, powerful countries, are engaging on a dialogue basis and a warming approach to Fiji. New Zealand and Australia have been looking like they're the churlish ones on the block at the moment.
Julie, your final word?
My final word is vagina.
Let's hear it.
Am I allowed to say that on
You
the
can-
show?
you- of course you can.
Fantastic. I'd like to give some kudos to Carefree for putting the V word in their advertising campaign.
Yes.
We've had decades of advertising for the euphemistically named feminine products without mentioning the body part that they actually address.
Outrageous.
And now Carefree are out there with vagina, and out there loud and proud. And I think it's great. We should treat all our body parts with honour and respect, regardless of whether we use them for sex or not.
Amen. We should certainly love the vagina. Thank you, Julie. Thank
I
you,
thought you'd
Selwyn.
like
Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. Fresh from the utter hypocrisy of a booze and tobacco pimp like Peter Dunn cracking down on party bills, the New Zealand police proudly declared 2,500 marijuana arrests as their contribution to the insanely counterproductive war on drugs. That's 2,500 people pointlessly clogging our prisons and justice system for a substance far less harmful than booze or tobacco. We spend 700 million on marijuana prohibition. That is an eye-watering waste of taxpayer money to supposedly protect us, especially when alcohol and cigarettes are killing people right now, every day. If this is a victory in the war on drugs, I'd hate to see what a loss looks like. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget, my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.